Why does evolution not work? Just a couple of good ones. Wow, well, gee, Isaac, you have a habit of picking the ones that I can't answer. Of course, I'm kidding. There are so many different reasons why evolution doesn't work, but I think the clearest way to answer... I'm not sure that the question is phrased correctly. I would perhaps rephrase it as, why do you believe evolution is not true, or in some other way. But even taking it the way that it's phrased, why does evolution not work? My answer would be, because the predictions that the theory makes do not match reality. For example, and now of course there are many different fields of science we could look to, I'm going to pretty much be staying in two areas, paleontology and biology. Now, like I said, we could go into astronomy, we could go into just about any number of areas, but I'm going to focus on paleontology and astronomy. I'm going to focus on paleontology and biology. When it comes to paleontology, we find multiple out-of-place artifacts. Out-of-place artifacts are also known as OOPArts. Now, these include such examples as the London artifact, which Ian Juby recently wrote an article about in his newsletter. There's also the coal pot, a cast iron pot which was found in coal, supposedly 295 million years old. Then there's also been a bell found in coal at least 250 million years old. There's human fossils that have been found throughout the rock record. We even find human and dinosaur bones mixed together, and mammoth bones mixed together as well, in the Ashley phosphate beds in the Carolinas. There was an entire book written by geologist John Watson called Man, Mammals, and Dinosaurs Together on that very topic. The next evidence that evolution does not work, or that its predictions do not match reality, would be a phenomenon known as stasis. Now, if evolution is true, the creatures that we find in the fossil record should be clearly simpler and especially different than the ones alive today. But there are numerous examples of stasis, where a creature is nearly identical to what it is today, or, alternatively, that really the only difference is size. In the fossil record, we'll find some creatures much larger than today, but otherwise basically the same, except for much larger. And take your pick. Sea creatures such as, the coelacanth, labeled as 450 million years old, and they used to consider it as a human ancestor until it was found to still be alive in, I believe that was 1938. The Wollemi pine tree, found still alive in Australia. And, take your pick. There are any number of examples. Fish, sharks, gastropods, which are like snails and other shelled creatures, crabs, horseshoe crabs especially, shrimp, dragonflies, there's quite a number. And as I already said, we find human fossils throughout the rock record. We find, just in great profusion, we find human fossils throughout the rock record. Another reason why evolution does not work is the law of biogenesis. Louis Pasteur coined the law of biogenesis, which states that life begets life, and like begets like. This means that life comes only from life, and creatures reproduce after their kind. This is in stark contrast to two areas of the theory of evolution. This contradicts both the origin of life hypothesis for evolution and the idea of evolution in a macroevolutionary sense of transmuting one species into another. Another area which shows that evolution does not work is the fact that there is contradictory evidence. Now, aside from the other examples of contradictory evidence that I've presented, and will also continue to present after this, what I mean specifically is genetics and morphology. It used to be that animals were grouped together based on something called comparative anatomy. Scientists, biologists mostly, would take the different parts of a creature, for example, the hand of a human, or the fin of a whale, the flipper of a dolphin, the foot of a reptile, and so on and so forth, and they would examine them and compare them to each other to see if they had similar design. Now note that common design could be just as well an example of, or an evidence for, a common designer. Common design could be just as much evidence for a common designer as it could for a common ancestor. But what has happened now is with genetics, they also assemble these phylogenetic trees, tracing it all back to one ancestor. But the problem is that the phylogenetic trees based on morphology and the phylogenetic trees based on genetics contradict each other. For example, standard phylogeny associates whales and dolphins as being distant from most other mammals because they live in the ocean. However, an analysis of the Preston hearing gene, which allows them to echolocate, this gene in some whales and in dolphins is exactly the same, and I do mean exactly the same, as in bats. So, if we go by the Preston hearing gene sequence, the phylogenetic tree would group bats, dolphins, and whales in the same group. But if we go by comparative anatomy, they are quite distantly separated as far as other mammals are concerned. So, even in these examples, do we go with genetics, or do we go with comparative anatomy? Comparative anatomy, which has been the standard way of creating these trees of life for almost as long as Darwin's book has been in print, or possibly even earlier. Cuvier was one of the first comparative anatomists, or at least one of the first famous ones. But what does evolution do when there's contradictory evidence like this, where species are actually far too similar in some aspects to match the theory of evolution? Well, evolutionists just claim this is a different type of evolution. It's parallel evolution. These unrelated species evolved in a similar way, to the point where the Preston gene, which is exactly the same in bats, dolphins, and whales, is claimed to have independently evolved in all three of them. Well, then that raises a question. If it independently evolved in all three of them, how can you then take other similarities and create a pattern of relatedness? If the exact sequence of the Preston hearing gene could appear independently in three unrelated groups, how can we know that any similar genes are actually proof of relatedness? Now, actually, from the design of a creationist, this is no problem, because God can certainly design a hearing gene in the bat, dolphin, and whale that's exactly the same. And I don't see a problem with that, because it's not proof of relatedness. It's proof of intelligent design, a creator who likes beauty and chose to give these creatures this ability. That's not an evidence for evolution, and considering that it's that comparative anatomy and genetics contradict each other, and by the way, there are many examples of this that I could cite, this being only one of them, but I will move on. Another great evidence showing that the predictions of evolution do not match reality is the fact that the human genome is degrading. It is deteriorating. The information in it is being lost. Now, what happens is every single generation, between 1% and 2% of your DNA is either deleted or miscopied in such a way that the information in it is lost. Now, this poses a problem. In fact, this was published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The title of the article asked the question, could it pose a health risk? The high mutation rate in the human genome, could it pose a health risk? Now, and that is a very fascinating question, because what happens when you plot this 1 to 2% deterioration 1 to 2% every generation, is you find out that the human population can only be a couple hundred generations old. Now, if the Bible is true, we are only in about the 175th generation. There were 75 generations from Adam to Jesus, or from Adam to Joseph, I forget which. But there were 75 generations before Christ, and if we go by an average of 20 years per generation, then there have been about 100 generations since Christ was born. 100 plus 75 makes 175. So there have been, and now some of these will vary a little bit. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, 200. Well, that is in itself a problem. Even if we go with the arguments that are best for evolution, that allow more generations, we still don't get that many. Now, this is very contradictory to the theory of evolution, which says that instead of losing information, our genomes should be increasing in information. We should be getting new and useful information in our gene code. And in fact, what has been observed, what has been scientifically verified and published, is that instead of getting new and beneficial genetic information in our DNA, we are actually losing information. If we looked at the creation model based on the Bible, we would say that God originally created it perfect, and that since that time it has been destroyed. It has decreased since that time, and may in fact still be decreasing today. The evolution theory says no, we keep getting better, we're not getting worse, but creation says we are worse than we used to be. Now, in the area of genetics, the published literature sides with creation, the idea that we are inferior to our ancestors genetically. We are losing information in our DNA, our gene code is deteriorating. The human species, even if evolution could explain how it got here, it does not explain how it was able to stay here for millions of years. There's a maximum of only a few hundred generations allowed. By this fact alone, the degrading of our human genome limits the number of human generations to only a few hundred. And there is also something called the DNA repair system. Most mutations that happen in the DNA are caught by the DNA repair system. Endonuclease comes along and identifies an error in your gene code. It marks it. Exonuclease comes along and removes it. Polymerase comes along and fills in the correct base, and then ligase comes along and mends up, glues it all back together. So these four parts of your cellular machinery, endonuclease, exonuclease, polymerase, and ligase, form the DNA repair system. Now, this does not mean that all mutations are caught. Indeed, everyone would agree that mutations sometimes do happen. In fact, they happen quite often. The reason for this is simply that there are so many mutations happening that our body eventually cannot keep up.